Hi folks, hope yous are all keeping well this early 2022. Happy Valentine's Day to whoever, enjoys that one day of the year where you're allowed to show affection for someone else. Just to give you an update, Monarchs of England Part 3 is well underway, and I hope to start posting some preview art to Patreon. If you want access to those previews, as well as loads more benefits and exclusive content, you can support me at patreon.com/John D Ruddy. When I reach 250 patrons, I'll create a video about the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. Be sure to find loads of Manny merch available over at johndruddy.com. As much as I love delving into history, sometimes it can be fun to take all of those elements of old history, of weapons and warriors and castles, and throw them into a wonderful fantasy world. That's right, folks, we're talking about Raid Shadow Legends. If you've heard of Raid Shadow Legends, you know it's got loads of champions, like over 600 champions, but it's also got an insane variety of bosses too, and that's what makes this game really cool. Let's put one of those bosses in the spotlight today. The Guardian of the Void Keep, Malak Kavar. He was once a priest of the light, but he had an epiphany while stargazing one night. The way he saw it, light wasn't much of anything without darkness. Maybe he was right, maybe not, but his fellow priests didn't care for it, and they exiled him from the order. Lucky for us, he went off to master the magic of the void, so we have a nice supply of void potions to ascend our champions with. Not so lucky for us, he has something of a chip on his shoulder about the whole being exiled thing, so he's not giving up his potions without a fight. The main trick to fighting Malak is dealing with all of the poison he throws at you. Raid has a ton happening this month, with a fresh rotation of the brutal Hydra boss, which is really cool. There are tons of events and tournaments every single day, including some special Valentine's Day events where you can get your hands on a brand new legendary champion. This is actually the best time to get started in Raid. If you click my link in the description or scan my QR code here, or wherever it is on the screen, it should be here, you'll get cool bonuses such as a free epic champion, Tyrell, 200k silver, 1 energy refill and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in game. These rewards are only available to new players and only available for the next 30 days, so all the more reason for you to get started now. Once you get started, all of your treasures should be up here. So get in now, Raid Shadow Legends, all the way. And now, onto our video about communism. Manny does history. The Russian Empire was one of the biggest empires in the world. Most of the European capitalist empires spreading across the world had monarchs in charge. The Russian Empire was no different. The Tsar at the beginning of the 20th century was Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty, and he had complete control over the empire. The second half of the 19th century saw Marxism becoming popular among many of the working people. German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels suggested that capitalism would lead to a growing divide between the working class and the capitalist class who employed them. The rich would get richer off the backs of the hard-working people on the ground. This division, they suggested, would lead to a social revolution of the workers, a redistribution of the wealth among the people, and ultimately communism, a classless, stateless, humane society built on the people's common ownership, each giving what they can and taking what they need. If only people were so simple. Many people in Russia worked as serfs, unfree peasants who were bound to work the land. They were freed in 1861 by the Tsar at the time, which led to a huge new working class moving into the cities.
Within the Russian Empire, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was set up to unite many of the revolutionary groups angry at the Tsar. It was deemed illegal, so they met in various cities in Western Europe. Divisions within this party, mainly between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, led to a split. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, believed that a true communist revolution could only work with a strong leadership of one person or perhaps a small select few. Disagreeing with Menshevik Julius Martov's views, Lenin and the Bolsheviks split away to work on their own. Lenin spent most of his time in Western Europe, writing Marxist publications, convening with fellow socialists. A lot of people were annoyed that Nicholas wasn't leading Russia into a modern society. He was too much of a control freak. Russia's embarrassing loss to Japan in 1905 didn't help. A large workers' protest against the Tsar in the capital St. Petersburg led to the massacre of protesters at the hands of the Imperial Guard, sparking the 1905 revolution. Various workers' councils, or Soviets, were established to organise and coordinate the protests and revolution. Workers, peasants, and even some military led a crippling general strike against the Tsar, resulting in the Russian Empire becoming a constitutional monarchy and the establishment of the State Duma, the first elected parliament of Russia. Tsar Nicholas, however, did his best to limit the parliament's power and ensure the crown's authority. He would elect his own ministers and dissolve the State Duma for re-election whenever he wanted, which he did in 1906. The changing population of Russia saw increased people living in cities and more industry. People could share ideas and want more from the world. They could begin to see that they were being oppressed by the Tsars at the top. Farmers wanted to own the land they were working on. City life was overcrowded and sanitation was negligible. People were wanting a better way of life. Lenin returned briefly to Russia to help the Bolsheviks. To raise funds, he endorsed robbing trains, banks, post offices, and railway stations. Georgian Marxist Joseph Stalin led some of these robberies. Tsar Nicholas clamped down and arrested many revolutionaries. Lenin fled and stayed away from Russia for many years, settling in Switzerland. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Because Russia was allied with Serbia, they declared war on Austria-Hungary. So their ally, Germany, declared war on Russia, thus kicking off the First World War. Tsar Nicholas believed that a war would help unite the people of the Russian Empire against an old enemy and distract them from the harsh living conditions many were in. It did spark a wave of nationalism amongst the people, but it seemed more of a love of the country and not necessarily a love of the monarchy. St. Petersburg was renamed to Petrograd to sound less German. Because of the war, Russia's trade routes through the Ottoman Empire were cut off, leading to an economic crisis. The government began printing more and more money to pay for the war, which led to inflation. The cost of living was going up, and yet farmers weren't being paid enough for their produce, so they took to only growing food for themselves, leading to food shortages in the cities. People were angry at how the government were handling things. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas took charge of running the war to boost national morale. But he was pretty useless out there. He left his wife, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, to the running of the government in Petrograd. She was fairly useless too, constantly replacing government ministers, leading to huge government instability. The Russian people really disliked her too, because she was German, and because she was heavily influenced by strange mystic Grigory Rasputin. Troops on the front lines were not being properly supplied with munitions due to the struggling economy. The industry was there, but not the money to pay for it. Socialists across Europe had hoped that the imperialist war would be the perfect thing to unite the working people who were being used as cannon fodder and overthrow the monarchies of Europe, creating a communist utopia. If only reality was that simple. As the war trudged on, more and more skilled workers were being conscripted to the front lines. Even the military were beginning to grow tired of how badly the Tsar was handling this. The better supplied German forces were causing heavy losses amongst the Russian forces. The army was becoming more and more working class, as many peasants found themselves being promoted to officers to replace their dead predecessors. The hopelessness of the war seemed to be never ending, and many soldiers deserted. Revolutionary propaganda led to widespread strikes in 1916. In November, the State Duma warned Nicholas that he needed to form a new government to get things done. He ignored this and thoroughly annoyed pretty much everyone in the process. Nobles who had grown tired of Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina Alexandra lured Rasputin to one of their houses and assassinated him at the end of 1916. The people were at boiling point by the time 1917 arrived. Many nobles and politicians were sick of the political instability and suggested Nicholas relieve Alexandra of her power. He refused, and they realised that the Tsars were the problem. People on the streets of Petrograd began to gather in protest. The government began rationing flour and bread riots ensued. Factories went on strike in solidarity. Women came celebrating International Women's Day, all of which evolved into the February Revolution. Although, because Russia was still using the old Julian calendar at that point, the revolution happened in March according to our Gregorian calendar, but that's fine. It's the February Revolution. Nicholas, who was on his way to oversee the war, ordered the military to control the protests by force if necessary. Prime Minister Nikolai Golitsyn announced that the government would be dissolved until April, under order from the Tsar. As some soldiers clashed with protesters in the city, the 4th Company of the Pavlovsky Replacement Regiment left their barracks to engage the other soldiers and defend the people, but were ultimately disarmed. The system was crumbling fast. The next day, many of the military had mutinied and joined the rebellion. They went around hunting down policemen and gathering up weapons. A provisional committee of the State Duma was set up as a potential replacement for the government, restore law and order, and ultimately end the war for the Russian Empire against Germany. On the same day, the Petrograd Soviet was set up once again by the socialists. The Council of Ministers of Russia resigned, and the capital became controlled by the revolutionaries. Chairman of the Duma, Mikhail Rodchenko, invited 3 Grand Dukes to sign the Grand Manifesto, which was to be signed by Nicholas II, suggesting to him to introduce the constitutional system in Russia. While Nicholas was on his way to Petrograd, the soldiers guarding the imperial family in Tsarskoye Selo abandoned their posts. Nicholas's advisors suggested he should abdicate the throne, which he ultimately did. He named his brother as heir, but his brother saw how unpopular this would be with the people and politely declined the offer. During the chaos, some people dug up Rasputin's body and burned it, just to be sure. A provisional government was established by an alliance of liberals and socialists who wanted to organise elections for a proper democratically elected government. The royal family were placed under protective custody by the new provisional government. The Soviet, however, would not join the government. They held the people and the military, so they held the real power. They shared power for a time throughout March, the Soviet always having the final say in how things developed. The Russian Empire was reorganised into the Russian Republic. In the wake of the February Revolution, Lenin thought it was the perfect time to return to Russia. Germany actually helped him get to Russia, hoping he would destabilise them further and bring them out of the war. In July, after a disastrous Russian offensive against the Central Powers, 500,000 people, including soldiers and sailors, came out in protest in Petrograd. Not enough change was seen since February. Lenin and the Bolsheviks disowned the chaotic protest, but the provisional government interpreted it as a Bolshevik coup and called for the arrest of many prominent Bolsheviks. Lenin hid in Finland. Another prominent Bolshevik, Leon Trotsky, was arrested. Socialist revolutionary Alexander Kerensky became the head of government and promoted freedom of speech, released many political prisoners, and sought to continue the war against Germany. In August, General Lavr Kornilov ordered an army towards Petrograd to restore law and order. Kerensky feared a coup and ordered them to stop. Kornilov continued. Kerensky turned to the Petrograd Soviets to help, which they did by calming things down with the army. The Bolsheviks had been growing steadily in popularity, overtaking the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. In September, the Petrograd Soviet released all Bolshevik prisoners, including Trotsky, who became chairman of the Soviet. The people on the ground were not happy with the government. Miners, railroad workers, metal workers, oil workers, textile workers, they were all organising Soviets and taking control of their means of production. It was at this time that the hammer and sickle came into use, the hammer representing the industrial worker, the sickle representing the agricultural worker. Lenin saw that it was time and returned to Petrograd to make the grand move. The Bolsheviks' military committee, led by Trotsky, began planning a proper armed rising. Because the Soviets controlled almost all the military and the railways, Petrograd and the Provisional government were isolated. The Bolsheviks made their plans public to maximize people's participation. Thus began the October Revolution on October 25th of the Julian calendar. Pro-Bolshevik ships arrived and supported the uprising. The Soviet armed volunteers, the Red Guards, captured important spots throughout the city. Helplessly trapped within Petrograd, Kerensky fled the Winter Palace, where the Provisional government was based, and managed to get out of the city to look for reinforcements. Lenin proclaimed to the people that the Provisional government were overthrown by the Soviets as they moved in on the Winter Palace. The revolution had been relatively bloodless and the Bolsheviks wanted to keep it that way, so they held off on a full assault on the Winter Palace. As more and more forces closed in, those guarding the Winter Palace abandoned their posts and it was ultimately captured by the Soviets, forcing the Provisional government to surrender. What a day! Power was transferred to the Soviets, but the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks walked out in protest, thinking it was too much of a power grab for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Lenin became leader of the government, initially not to great support from the people, but as the days went on, the people seemed to be won over. Kerensky arrived to Tsarskoye Selo with anti-revolutionary Cossacks and ended up firing upon Russian troops, turning them against him and the old government all the more. The revolution was over, but in many ways was only just beginning. Lenin acted quickly to bring Russia out of the war in Europe. The Bolsheviks would go on to develop Russia into the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, nationalising land and industry for the people, becoming the first constitutional socialist state. The capital would later be moved back to Moscow. And the entire Romanov family were brutally executed by the Soviets in 1918. Amidst the chaos of the war and revolution, some nations sought independence from the old Russian Empire. Some were successful. Many would be later reabsorbed into what became the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the Soviet Union would become one of the most powerful nations in the world, but not before a brutal civil war with anti-Bolshevik forces rallying together in the White Army to fight the Bolshevik Red Army, which would go on until 1922. But that, and indeed the early bloody years of the Soviet Union, is a story for another time.
Ba-bum.